I wanted to start with the employment effects. And the study that I was reading, I saw that you looked into California and New York, who raised their minimum wage over around a 7-year period. What kind of results did you find in pertaining to earning increases and the disemployment effect of that?
For sure. So maybe it's worth giving just a little bit of context before I jump into what we found. Back, especially prior to the 1990s, there was sort of a just general presumption made by a lot of economists that labor markets were what we call competitive. And what that means is that the little model that people are often taught in their very first year economics class, or maybe in high school economics, where supply equals demand and the market clears at some certain price and everything's perfect. Like that was sort of the presumption about labor markets, that there are lots of employers out there and workers can just like leave if they don't like the wage that's being offered and go somewhere else. It's very easy. And so wages would always be what they should be. And if you increase the minimum wage above that, then that would result in a lower quantity of labor demanded. So disemployment, the loss of jobs. Starting in especially the 1990s, though it was proposed and talked about many decades even earlier by Joan Robinson, but especially looking in the 1990s and then again from the 2010s on, there's been a lot of empirical research which has been done very well and found actually when minimum wages have been increased, there have been no negative employment effects, or to the extent that anything was found, it was tiny and often not statistically significant. And the general idea, the explanation here was what was originally proposed by Joan Robinson, but was elaborated on a lot more in more recent decades, that if you actually have an absence of perfect competition, that is, if for some reason employers have some ability to set wages below what would obtain in a perfect competitive market, then there is room for wages to be raised without them being like, oh, forget it, now the wage is too high, I'm not hiring anymore. In fact, the idea behind what are called monopsony models, and there are several types, but these models essentially say that because labor supply is what we call upward sloping or not perfectly elastic, that is, it does respond to changes in wages, that you could actually have increases in employment when you have an increase in the minimum wage. And the reason for this is that, the simplest explanation is that lots of existing employees are not going to be happy if a new employee is hired on at a higher wage. They're going to be, no, if you want me to stick around, then you're going to have to pay me that higher wage too. And so the actual price of hiring someone at a higher wage without a minimum wage in place is actually going to be more than just that higher wage rate. You're actually going to have to compensate all your existing workers the difference as well. And so a lot of employers will say, forget it, I'm not going to. But if a minimum wage forces the wage for everybody there, then the employer says, okay, I'm just going to hire the right amount of people for me at that wage rate. That's the general idea. So there was this conflict that sort of existed, especially in the 90s. People were really questioning this, some economists, but the consensus has really shifted. In 2015, there was this survey of economists done, asked, do you think there will be large disemployment effects if the minimum wage increases substantially? And the majority of economists were like, yeah, I don't really know on that. It could go either way. Lots said, no, I don't think so. So fast forward to what we've done, we decided that we wanted to look at this massive increase in the minimum wage in California and in New York. So prior to 2014, the minimum wage in California had been $8 an hour for several years. In New York, it had been $7.25 an hour. And the federal minimum wage hasn't changed since 2009. So a few places have increased it a little bit, but some places have increased it quite a lot. But really, California and New York had these massive policy changes where California, just across the board, the minimum wage is going to go from $8 and it was going to increase a lot, and then subsequently was changed to go up to what it is today, which is obviously even higher than $15. In New York, it was scheduled for fast food workers specifically to increase to $15. For both states, this happened by about the end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022, hitting $15 in California. And so what we wanted to do is say, hey, this is a huge increase in the minimum wage. If there really are negative employment effects or just harms for workers, it should show up in this, right? Like if you're going to double the minimum wage, then the effect has to be there. And so we employed the state-of-the-art econometric methods, a stacked synthetic control estimator, essentially for each of these counties that we picked to look at in California, New York. We individually estimate the effect and then we aggregate them. And we found that there was, prior to the pandemic, big increases in earnings and no effect at all on employment, which is consistent with either the minimum wages having some positive increase on earnings for workers and then maybe not quitting their jobs as much because we saw fewer separations in that time, or consistent to some degree with a monopsony model. But then when we look during and post-pandemic, what we find, especially after we correct for some different responses to the pandemic that happened in different areas of the country, what we see is that there was actually then a smaller increase in earnings over that period, but we saw a positive employment effect, which we actually estimate to be statistically significant. But overall, when you look at our results, what we're finding is that there is certainly no evidence at all of negative effects on these workers. Fast food workers tend to be among the lowest paid. The largest share of them make at or near the minimum wage, and they were just not experiencing any harms. They were benefiting. They had higher earnings. And so this seems like something that should be talked about when we're having these broader conversations on minimum wage increases at the state level and federally.
And when I was reading your paper, I did see how you said there were differences pre-pandemic and after, and I wanted to ask you about some of those as well. But first, I wanted to ask, because to my belief, I think you did work to kind of differentiate high wage from more like lower wage income markets and see if there were effects for those maybe on like the lower end side. Were there any kind of differing effects that you found in your research, or was it pretty much the same?
Yeah, this was actually interesting. So we were maybe concerned that there could be some bias in estimates that don't take into account the fact that some places have substantially higher wages, like San Francisco, like Manhattan. We thought, well, maybe those places can accommodate higher wages naturally, or maybe it's not even going to make a difference. Maybe they're more inclined to, in fact, raise their own local minimum wages above the state mandated level because they're richer places, they're expensive to live, and the employers are already paying wages above that minimum wage just to find anybody. So we thought, okay, let's account for that bias and let's do two different robustness checks, we call them. Let's, in the first place, get rid of all of the high income places around the San Francisco Bay Area and New York City. And in the second, let's get rid of all the places that chose to have higher local minimum wages, because maybe the places, especially say in California or in upstate New York, where you're talking red counties where they were resistant to or really opposed to these changes, maybe you'd find the negative employment effects there. And actually what we found was the opposite, that those places actually had larger positive employment effects. And that really jives with our monopsony story, that in fact, in those places in particular, there were employers, fast food employers, that had even more employer power, even more ability to set wages below what would be the competitive rate. And so minimum wages actually are especially important in those poorer places and those places that are saying, like, we actually don't want minimum wages. They're especially important to actually bring employment up and to bring earnings to what is really the competitive and therefore the fair level for these workers.
And you kind of already brought it up about COVID and it being different pre-pandemic to different after pandemic in terms of slightly lower earnings and then employment going up. Was there any like one thing that could be pointed to as like causation for that, or is that something maybe that needs a different angle of research in on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's more research that COVID is complicated. It's just complicated. We did an analysis. My co-author actually put out a separate paper looking at a lot of the things that were going on, a lot of the different policy changes. And if people are interested in reading that paper, I encourage them to take a look. I think it's quite accessible, by Michael Wright, 2024. But yeah, what we were really concerned about when we were looking at the pandemic was the possibility that some of the places that we saw have higher minimum wages in California, New York, where they actually saw these very, very sharp employment drops right at the beginning of the pandemic. We saw those across the board, but especially in around New York City and the San Francisco Bay Area and a few other places. And we thought, wow, is that just because minimum wages are actually bad when you have a pandemic or something awful, or was there something else going on? And of course, we know that those places were experiencing, generally speaking, much higher rates of migrant inflow. They're the big ports to the west and to the east, and they had governments that were more inclined to lock down quickly, lock down sharply, and then open up more gradually. And so once you account for those impacts, and what we did was actually go and look for the impact on people's time spent at restaurants and at stores, and then we used that cell phone tracking data to correct for things. We actually found that that really disappears, and there's no resulting consequence from minimum wages impacting any of that.
Awesome. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. The next part, I kind of wanted to ask you a couple definitions, maybe to just clear up for some people. What is monopsony? Yeah, what is monopsony and how does it pertain to this conversation?
So in its simplest sense, monopsony power is just employer power to set wages below the competitive rate. So if an employer has the ability to say, you're going to take this wage if you come work for me, rather than the employee saying, no, I'm going to take this higher wage and you'll accept it because I can go get it over there, and I will if you don't give it to me. If that little conversation where the employee bargains and says, no, I'm taking this wage, doesn't happen, if the employer can just say, you're going to take this low wage, then that's monopsony power. Because in theory, in a competitive market, firms don't have any power. They're just one of many firms that are looking for labor.
So when, I guess, in places that raised the minimum wage, was that kind of like done away with? Is it like by different markets? How did minimum wage kind of play into that?
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, when minimum wages are set in places where there is monopsony power, or just firms having that wage setting ability, you're essentially forcing employers to pay all of their employees at least that minimum wage. And so you've taken away that disincentive that they have for hiring more employees, since they have to pay everybody the new higher wage. And you have to pay a higher wage to attract another employee at the margin. If you get rid of that, then in theory, you can see positive employment effects, certainly not negative employment effects. And that is what we saw. And the fact that we saw the particularly positive, particularly large employment effect estimates in the pandemic period, once we looked only at the places that did not have high wages and did not select into local minimum wages, that really does strongly jive with our monopsony story. Essentially, minimum wages are going to result in higher earnings for workers and no negative employment effects. And what we actually saw, to help look at this farther, we looked at separation rates. And we said, hey, it looks like, in fact, we're finding that separation rates declined a lot. So workers are less inclined to just jump at the next opportunity they have to make a bit more if they're making a decent wage, even if it is the minimum wage. Also, firms are actually not suffering as much because they don't have to pay to recruit more people, to train people, to have low productivity from those new workers. So it's a beneficial thing for everybody.
You definitely you answered my next question for me before I could ask it. It was going to be about how it affected separation rates. I guess just to kind of define it in more layman's terms, that's just people's like ability or the rate in which they leave their job, isn't it?
Exactly. And in this, we didn't define it specifically whether the people are choosing to leave by quitting or whether they were fired. But generally speaking, this sharp reduction in separation rates with higher wages is strongly suggestive of these workers no longer quitting as much.
Awesome. Yeah. And then how much did you see the raising in minimum wage kind of affect prices? Did it get pushed on at a rate, like was it prices rising faster than wages? Was it more negligible? About how was the effect there?
Yeah, that's a really good question because a lot of people are cautioning this, especially in California with the increase in the fast food minimum wage. They're cautioning that businesses are being forced to raise their prices dramatically. And what we saw was there is absolutely evidence that prices increase some when minimum wages go up. I think it would be disingenuous for anyone to claim otherwise. Employers do say, well, you know, if I have higher costs, then part of that is going to be borne by my consumers if I'm able. But what we found was, especially once you account for the share of revenues that go to workers in the fast food industry, that's about 30%. Once you account for that, especially, we see that these price increases really only counted for about 50% of the minimum wage increase, about 55%. So there's still this whole big chunk of the minimum wage increase that had to be accounted for somewhere else. If these firms were not making what we call rents, sort of, an extra little bit off of their workers, then they wouldn't have been able to accommodate that. But when they are paying wages that are below the competitive rate, they have the ability to absorb these minimum wage increases and still be doing okay. And in fact, McDonald's franchisees are doing definitely okay, despite the claims that are being made.
Yeah, I think McDonald's will be around, until the end, I'm sure, no matter how high wages go. Which is
Right.
actually kind of plays into the next question I wanted to ask. Was there anything, and this might be outside the scope of your research, but was there anything in your research or research you've done that maybe shows that there's any bit of a ceiling for raising wages? Obviously not just shooting them to the moon just because, but say they rise with worker productivity. Was there any evidence that there's some sort of like this will be as high as they can go?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question that I think has fairly been asked by even some people who have seen us present this work. And the reality is we can't say what the ceiling would be. I don't think anyone thinks that you could increase minimum wages to $1 trillion an hour and still have employers saying, yeah, I'm still going to hire workers. But the question of what that ceiling is, it's an empirical one. And the reality is we just have not seen minimum wages increase enough to see disemployment effects. So while we can't say what the ceiling is, what we can say is certainly the evidence shows that you can increase minimum wages to $15 an hour and you do not see disemployment effects. So we have at least that evidence that you can do 15. So 15 is not the ceiling.
That's good to know. Definitely in the places like I'm in Indiana, so the minimum wage here is still 7.25. So, the closer we can get to that, the better off I think people here would be.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing that we found, so a lot of people are also concerned, well, maybe because you're looking at California and New York, they're special. So even if you're looking at these places that didn't raise their minimum wages and were not high income, maybe they're still just a lot richer and different than places like Indiana or West Virginia for Joe Manchin, who opposed a $15 federal minimum
Oh
wage.
God, yeah.
And what we find actually is that our treated counties, they span the income distribution prior to the increases starting. And so that means that they're really representative of the country as a whole. So especially these places that had lower incomes and no local minimum wages, they're going to be a lot more comparable to places in Indiana or in West Virginia. So really our results are results that people should extrapolate to the rest of the country. These minimum wage increases, they would benefit these low wage workers. We would not see negative employment effects.
Yeah, and the last two questions I have for you are more opinion based. So, feel free to go answer however you feel. The first one, and I like to ask this to everybody who's done extensive research on anything, what do you think, and it might be something you've already named as well, what do you think either to you or for other people who haven't looked into it, what's the most shocking finding you think you saw or realized in your data?
Honestly, what I just said was a little surprising to me. Prior to doing this research, I was someone who was a bit more inclined to think, well, maybe you need to have place specific minimum wages because you need to account for the different costs of living in each place. Maybe that's true at whatever that unknown upper bound is, but certainly what we've seen is actually the opposite. The fact that you saw these larger positive employment effects in the pandemic period in the places that were the poorest, in the places that didn't choose to have higher minimum wages, that was surprising to me. But as I thought about it more, I thought, oh, it actually does make more sense. Those places are more likely to be characterized by employer power. So yeah, I got to learn several things and got to be challenged and to think anew with the results that we had. And I thought that was very cool.
Definitely, yeah, and that's, the best part, I'm sure, of doing research and things is even getting to learn stuff yourself you might have not known all the entire time. The last thing I want to ask you is, again, just opinion. What do you think has made this so polarizing from both sides, really? Where you have, I think Barbara Lee in California was saying, minimum wage needs to be $50 an hour. You have like that on one side, to where Republicans or people on the other side are like, we can't have it above 725, or it needs to be lower. Why do you think people can't just look at the data like in the way you have and see like it can be raised, so it should be?
This is the important question. I'm glad you asked this, because this is ultimately what it comes down to. I think there are several factors that play into it, but I'm giving my opinion here, as you suggested. I think there is a lot of fear among some people that the stories that have been told without good evidence to back it up are true, that if you're a restaurant worker and the minimum wage increases, you might get fewer hours or lose your job. That could be really harmful. So I think there is fear among some people who are doing their best just to listen to what they're being told by other people as they're doing their job. They don't have necessarily the time or the training to look into these things. I do think that there are a lot of employers who benefit from having employer power. They have become very profitable and have done very well. They have a vested interest in keeping wages low. The lower you can keep your wages and still sell as much as you can, the more you are going to do well. And so I think there is a very cynical involvement in keeping minimum wages low. And I think politically then, on that side against it, unfortunately, you've got a lot of politicians, really a party that has shown at this point it is willing to do anything to try to retain power, and that includes keeping its donors happy, and its donors happen to be those people who have a vested interest in keeping minimum wages low, and its voters might be those people who are afraid of losing their jobs. On the other side, I think $50 an hour as a minimum wage, that's probably a campaign slogan rather than an actual policy proposal. I think anyone reasonable would say like some sort of ramp up with testing and the potential for an off ramp would make more sense than saying just raise it to 50 right away. That there is this, in America, there is this sense of you're either with us or against us. It's very binary. I'm no longer in the States. I'm up in Canada now, where I grew up. My time in the States was awesome in a lot of ways, but wow, it was just exhausting, that political culture. It was either you're in this group or you're Satan. and it's not healthy. It's not conducive to just a society that is healthy. It really does not care about the actual well-being of low-wage workers, which frankly I think should be one of our top priorities. If minimum wages were harmful to low-wage workers, I would want to be finding the research evidence that said it was harmful so we could stop it. But the evidence is saying the opposite. And so because of that, I think that we should be following what the research says to the benefit of those low-wage workers. And that should be the only thing that guides us. We should not be worried about the larger political perspective. We should care about how people are doing.